I'm Zoe and I work for the charity Wellbeing of Women, and I manage the Menopause Explored programme at the charity. So Menopause Explored is predominantly a face-to-face program where we go out to small businesses and we deliver menopause in the workplace training. And this webinar is part of a series of webinars that we're doing to reach more people. This is webinar number 2 of 5. Number 1 you can find on our YouTube channel, and after this we will send you details of how to find that, and all of the subsequent webinars, so 1 a month between now and March, and all of those will also be on YouTube, and you'll also be able to join for free. And then I'm just going to hand you over to my colleague Liz Cunningham. She's going to introduce herself, helping the rest of the panel today.
Hi everybody, thanks Zoe. I'm Liz Cunningham and my business is Menopause Reality. We use immersive film shared in virtual reality headsets to share women's own experiences of the menopause. And we've been working with Wellbeing of Women on their Menopause Xplored project for almost 3 years now. And we've really enjoyed delivering these as face-to-face workshops, but we're also really enjoying this new series of webinars. So pleased to bring you these. As Zoe says, we've got an hour today. So and we're going to be taking questions for the last 10 to 15 minutes. So please pop any questions in the chat if they crop up along the way. I'm going to hand over to Diane to introduce herself, and after we've met Diane, I will introduce Helen.
Thank you, Liz. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Diane Danzebrink. I'm the founder of Menopause Support. So we're a purpose over profit organisation, and we pretty much do what it says in the title. We provide support for individuals, their family, their partners, and for businesses and organisations. And we try and provide lots of free resources for menopause information, etc. I'm also the author of a book called Making Menopause Matter.
Thank you very much. And Helen, we met Helen through making one of the immersive films through the program. And so the people who come along to our in-person workshops will get to hear Helen's story in much more detail. But thank you for joining us today, Helen. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do, first of all, please?
Yeah, of course. So hello everybody. I'm Helen Wardropper. I'm a business advisor at the North East BIC. Part of my role involves helping startup businesses go through the whole journey from start to potential growth. And within that, we do workshops, we do one-to-ones, we do presentations, and we go out into the community and we involve as many partners as we can in terms of the type of work that we do. So it's very hands-on, very busy.
And very varied from all the different kinds of businesses that you work with and the different kind of roles that you do. Can you tell us a little bit how your menopause symptoms were affecting you in your role?
Working in a very male-dominated environment before, I would sit there and have hot flushes. There was temperature issues in the office. There was a lack of understanding. I would see in terms of some of our colleagues, the way it directly affected us was the hot flushes. In the very nature of the job I do, it was very difficult to do that when you have things like brain fog and lack of concentration. You're expected to be super focused, and that ethos is always on you to deliver. So it feels a lot. It can feel a lot at times.
Absolutely. And the way that your menopause symptoms affect you now, you mentioned the hot flushes and the brain fog. Are they kind of your main symptoms, or do you have any others that you?
Yeah, I have things like dry mouth and things like that, what I never had. So I'm constantly drinking water, having to think about it, having to time myself in meetings and things like that. The concentration thing and the brain fog is actually quite disruptive, I would say, to me role day to day.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you. We're going to come back in a little bit to talk about the support that you have had or may not have had at work. But we'll go Just for anybody who didn't join the last webinar, Diane, I think it would be really helpful to just do a little bit of a brief reminder or brief introduction. You mentioned the title of your book, Making Menopause Matter. So let's start with the question, why does menopause matter, or why do we need to make it matter?
Well, the reason it does matter is because it's going to happen to approximately half of the world's population, which is currently just in excess of 8 billion people. So there's going to be a lot of people who are directly affected by menopause. But equally, there will be the other half of the population who are indirectly affected because they will be family members, partners, friends, colleagues, etc. So that's really why we all need to understand something about it, because if it's not going to happen to us personally, it's certainly going to happen to somebody that we know. So that's why it's useful for everyone to know about it. We also need to think about the fact that, thinking about the UK, we currently have around 4.6 million women over the age of 50 in the workplace. So that's one of the highest numbers that we've ever seen for that demographic, but it's also one of the fastest growing demographics. So that's just the women over 50. That's not taking into account all of those who are under the age of 50 and also experiencing perhaps perimenopause, surgical menopause, medically induced menopause, premature menopause, etc. So I think there's a really good common sense reason for us all to know about it. But equally, if we all have some understanding of menopause before it comes along, for those who are going to experience it personally, it hopefully gives them the information that they need to make some informed choices for themselves. But it also means that if you are going to be in a supporting role, whether that's in a personal or a professional relationship, that you feel better equipped to be able to support those around you.
Fantastic, thank you. You just touched on a few terms there that I think maybe be good to get just what an answer to the bigger question even, which is what is menopause? You mentioned peri and early and post, and just to give us all, so we're all starting from the same place.
Yeah.
What is it?
Okay, so menopause is the word that is used to essentially explain what is a diverse experience. I think we would be better particularly for those who experience what is generally referred to as a spontaneous or sometimes a natural menopause. So this is the menopause experience that most women will have. This is where they begin with perimenopause. So perimenopause is the time when for those who are going to be symptomatic, they might start to experience symptoms. And the reason they're experiencing those symptoms is because the hormone levels are fluctuating more regularly and sometimes more significantly than they would usually do for a monthly cycle. And the reason they start to do that is because there comes a point in every woman's life where the eggs that she is born with in her ovaries, they reduce to a critical level. And this is where so they get very low. And this is where those hormone levels, we're talking about estrogen and progesterone, they start to, with progesterone starts to fall away, with estrogen it starts to fluctuate more regularly, sometimes significantly. And this is for the 3 out of 4 approximately who will experience symptoms. This is where those symptoms can begin to come along. So for many, that will begin in their late 30s, early 40s. Doctors often tell us that, all females will be perimenopausal by the time they're 45. It's very unusual for somebody not to be perimenopausal by the time they're 45. that perimenopausal transition to the next stage, which is the clinical diagnosis of menopause. So the clinical diagnosis of menopause is when somebody has had 12 consecutive months without a period. That can be quite a lengthy time. So that can be several years. So as an example, if somebody begins their perimenopausal symptoms at 43, they might not have that time of having had 12 consecutive months without a period until perhaps their early 50s. Mm-hmm. Now, they may not have any symptoms. They might be one of the 1 in 4 who experience no or very few symptoms, but 3 out of 4 do have symptoms. And then everything after that menopause point, that clinical diagnosis, that's referred to as postmenopause. So that's the rest of your life, essentially. So that's what doctors would call a spontaneous or a natural menopause. But as I said, menopause can be diverse. Mm-hmm. So you might have those who experience a premature menopause. So that's menopause under the age of 40. Mm-hmm. You might have those who experience an early menopause. So that is classified as menopause between the ages of 40 and 45. You might have somebody who experiences a surgical menopause. So that's where they have both of their ovaries removed at the same time. So clinically, that's referred to as a bilateral oophorectomy. So that puts somebody into an immediate menopause. And you might have those who have a medically induced menopause. So that's where somebody is having medical treatment for another medical diagnosis. So perhaps they might have been diagnosed with a type of cancer, or perhaps they have very severe endometriosis. If somebody is going to be having chemotherapy or radiotherapy that has an effect on their ovaries, that can put them into what's called a medically induced menopause. For somebody who has a condition like severe endometriosis, one of the treatment pathways is to have the ovarian function suppressed by giving a certain type of treatment. But that in itself, whilst it's helping with the endometriosis, can bring on menopause symptoms. So it can be very varied.
We're going to come on in a second to talk about some examples of good support that people may have experienced in the workplace. But all of those experiences that you've just described, those diverse range of experiences, those women could well be in the workplace while they're going through those things. And I think one other bit that we just need to have a grasp of before we move on to support is to just get a bit of an overview. Helen mentioned some specific symptoms that she had experienced, but I wonder if you could just give us a kind of an umbrella view of menopause symptoms generally, so that we know what we're trying to support.
Yeah, absolutely. So we will do exactly that. We'll do an umbrella, but as Liz and Zoe both referred to, in the first one of this series, we do go into all of this in much more detail. But essentially, symptoms really fall into 3 categories: physical, cognitive, and psychological. So Helen mentioned what doctors refer to as vasomotor symptoms, hot flushes and night sweats. They're the ones I think that most people are very aware of. They're the ones that most people know about. But physical symptoms can also be things like heart palpitations, achy joints and muscles, perhaps things like itchy skin, dry eyes. Helen mentioned dry mouth, drinking a lot of water. There are all sorts of symptoms that can potentially be related in terms of physical symptoms, because we have estrogen receptors all over the body. So when those levels start to fluctuate, the effects can be different for everybody. In terms of the cognitive symptoms, again, Helen, you mentioned your brain fog being, being a challenge for you. So brain fog, again, is sort of an umbrella term, and what we're really talking about are changes to memory and concentration, which really can be, a significant challenge in any part of life, but particularly if you're in a busy workplace. And then the psychological symptoms. So the psychological symptoms, I would say, in sort of a decade of working in this space, these are the ones that we hear about the most regularly, and probably the ones that people experience but don't know can potentially be related to changing hormone levels. So they're things like increased levels of anxiety, low mood, mood fluctuation, even changes to levels of confidence can potentially be associated. And then there's a sort of, I guess, a subset of physical symptoms that people often find very difficult to talk about. And I've certainly spoken to a lot of people who say sometimes they even find it difficult to talk to their partner or perhaps their GP about these symptoms. And they're, again, what doctors call the genitourinary symptoms of menopause. So they're things like increased urinary frequency, urgency, urinary tract infections. If you're somebody who works out on a site, that can be really difficult. Or things like vulval and vaginal symptoms, dryness, soreness, irritation, etc. And again, if you're somebody who's sitting at a desk on a chair for 8 hours a day and you're experiencing those symptoms, again, that can be a real challenge.
And I think sometimes there is an assumption that those symptoms are nothing to do with work, but actually, all symptoms will affect you and may affect your ability to do your job.
Absolutely.
So Helen, thank you very much, Diane. That's really helpful to get that overview. I'm going to come back to you to ask, I know that you've had a number of different roles, in the time that you've been experiencing some your menopause symptoms, and I know that you've had some great support and some not so great. But let's start with some good support. Can you tell us about something that was really helpful for you, that was an example of support in the workplace that you received?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would probably start off with the awareness reason and open them conversations. So not allowing those conversations to be as stigmatic as they potentially would be, and being able to freely talk about them, whoever's in the room, allowing that free conversation and that open conversation without embarrassment. So trying to sort of break down those walls a little bit. I would also say that in my workplace at the moment, we've got an unofficial term where we sort of have like head down time. And our head down time can alleviate quite a lot of those things. So for instance, if I was having the hot flushes in the office and I really couldn't concentrate and I'm sitting there and I'm not being productive, I can then take myself out of that situation and go and work somewhere else. So we are lucky in that respect that we have different places where we can use as our venue. This is used as a term with men and women in the office, so you don't stand out if you're going to just remove yourself and go somewhere else.
So tell us so that's, you call it head down space, head down time. So what does it mean then? It's just that you can take yourself out?
Yeah, take yourself out of the situation, go and sit somewhere a little bit cooler if necessary, take yourself away from distractions and things like that. So you're working in a private office, or you're working we've got an atrium area, which is quite zen, absolutely lovely with, trees and all sorts in it. It's lovely colours. So I think from that respect, you can go in and you can almost gather your thoughts again and then be productive again. And sometimes all it takes is 5 minutes out, go and get a nice cold wash or a nice cold cup of water or whatever, and gather your thoughts again and sort of come back. But without that, I think it's difficult. You wouldn't be able to do that in every workplace.
Yeah. How about support that you've received directly from colleagues? How important has that been, or have you had any good support from colleagues?
Yeah, I think there's a level of understanding. So I think in terms of the dynamic, the demographics sometimes of where you work, how you work, who you work with. So like I mentioned before, it was primarily males that I'd worked with before. And that was a difficult environment. It was a joked about topic. It was not something that was happening to you. It was just, something that was the butt of other people's jokes a lot of the time. So that's difficult, because it wasn't taken seriously. And I think when you're in an environment where you have, I work with mostly ladies at the moment, some of them which have gone through menopausal symptoms and have come out the other end, and good and bad experiences. But where there's that level of understanding and that openness to talk about it, it can already start to make you feel a little bit less pressured, in terms of that environment, and be able to sort of thrive and do what you need to do in that environment where that's allowed almost.
That's great, thank you. Diane, though Helen has shared a couple of examples, I think the head down time sounds really, really useful in whatever way you can implement that. But are these common? Can you share any others? What are your kind of go-to tips for where to start if somebody's wanting to put in good support in the workplace?
So I think it's really clear that, as we said right at the top, the information and education is absolutely vital, because ultimately you can't support what you don't understand. So if you don't understand, and I think just going back to what Helen said, kind of the joking around it, I think, much of that historically has come from, myth going around and people simply not understanding what's happening, sometimes even to their own partners and their family members. And I think that's why information and education is so important, because I think if people do understand what's going on, they do have, kind of a better realization of what their colleague, their friend, their partner, and they can then show some empathy with what they're experiencing. So I think when we're talking about SMEs, small and medium businesses, I think one of the challenges sometimes to particularly the formal education piece can be that there simply isn't budget for that formal education piece. But I think with things like this series, which is going to be available, so there's now a growing number of free resources that are available. I know Zoe will kind of point to some of the other Wellbeing of Women resources later on, but there are more resources available, so there really is no excuse for not starting that process. So I think first of all we have to think about educating the team, educating everybody, so everybody having some understanding, so that everybody feels that I have enough information to feel that I can be not necessarily the person to implement a support strategy, because that's probably going to be down to one individual, but at least that I can show some care and some understanding to my colleague. I think that's a really good place to start. But again, we then have to go one step back from that and think, okay, so how does that sit within the culture of the organisation? And we hear this word culture bandied around all the time, but culture takes time to build and it needs to be led in the right way. So if we really truly want to support everybody, we have to have an organisation that doesn't just say it has a supportive culture, but actually demonstrates that it has a supportive culture. So I think, let's look at the culture, let's look at the information and the education that our team have, and then we have to think about every individual, sort of individually. We have to think, because you could have Helen and a colleague that she works alongside with exactly the same symptoms, but they might be managing them and experiencing them differently. And so consequently, the adjustments that might work for Helen might not work for her colleague, and vice versa. So it is very much about, obviously, if Helen or her colleague approach their line manager or somebody within their organisation. Depending on how big the organisation is, there may or may not be internal HR. But it's about thinking about, okay, if this person has taken the time to come and approach me, what can I do for them? So it's about thinking about individual adjustments, because adjustments can be very helpful. I love the head down time. I think that's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. For a lot of people, they would just refer to that as making sure that regular breaks are built in, not just built into the day, but pre-agreed, so that the individual then doesn't have to keep going back to their line manager and say, oh, I need to take a break. That's pre-agreed, that there is an amount of time that they can use to take breaks, and they do that as and when that they feel that they need to do it. But, you know, reasonable adjustments can be really useful, but it is really important that, A, they are reviewed on a regular basis, because I'm sure Helen will tell you things can change.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm going to come on to ask you about some of the challenges in a second, but just I thought, while we're still on sort of tips for good support, whoever you are in an organisation, whether you are the manager, the business owner, a line manager, or an employee who's just conscious, who might have joined this call and just wants to be a bit more equipped, is this what would you suggest? You know, if you're in an organisation where menopause has never been mentioned, have you got a tip? Where can they start? What would you do first?
Okay, so, well, if you're on this call, go back and talk to your team about what you've heard today, because it's a great way to open the conversation. Because how many webinars would you have joined in the past on other subjects, and you would go back to your team and you would share the knowledge? Why would you not do that with menopause? Because it is going to affect half of the population. So I think that's a really good way to start. But then, you know, if you're somebody within an organisation, and it could be, you know, it could be very small, and you think, actually, this is something that we could be talking about, you know, you could choose to use some of those free resources. You could sit down with your colleagues and you could say, you know, this is something that I'd like us to start talking about. These are some of the free resources that I've come across, but also invite them to collaborate. You know, what have you come across? What do you think could be helpful? And I think particularly in a small organisation, it's always really useful to get everybody on board by including them and saying, you know, what would you like to see? What would help you? It's often the same in a one-to-one conversation. You know, don't tell people what you can do for them. Ask them, what can I do to help you? Because, as I said, it's going to be different for everybody. You know, at Menopause Support, we have symptom posters, and it says at the top, could it be menopause? ? And then there are lots of thought bubbles around a person's head. They're great for putting up in the toilets. But all the toilets, not just the women's loos, put them up in all the toilets, because it's a great light bulb moment for people. Put them up in your communal areas, in your kitchen, etc., etc. Just things to make people recognise that this is something that we can talk about at work.
That's great, and that's some great tips for kind of getting started, I think, with conversations. So I'm just going to move on to talk about things that have been a bit more of a challenge, or things that might have been not quite so good, because we can learn from those as well. So Helen, coming back to you, you've shared some of the helpful, useful things that you've had in terms of support. What has been more difficult, or what can you share with us a little bit about when you didn't quite get the support you wanted to at work?
Yeah, I think in terms of the not so helpful things is the dismissive side of it. So you have a bit of a battle with the doctor to convince them that you're of the right age, or you're coming in with that. And then you've got the battle at work in terms of that level of understanding, and the dismissive side of that. So, you know, you've been at work for long days, you must just be silly if you're forgetting things, or you might be stupid, or things like that. And I think that, going back to what Diane said, as well as the confidence levels drop significantly. So I know that I'm good at my job, I know that I'm capable of doing my job. However, you don't ask for these symptoms, they come to you. So then you're sort of forced to cope with that. So I think in terms of that, not being there to support you or not back you up in times when you are clearly struggling to deliver something. So if that had been two people delivering a presentation or something and I'm really struggling, could be that they just sweep in and assist or do whatever. And them little tiny touches, although it doesn't seem a big thing, can be quite a lot, because it might just be that my thought process has gone for that moment, and it's something I haven't chosen, it's happened, and then that makes me feel really silly in that point of time. It's just having those extra little bits. But I think the confidence, all these little bits slide in, and then your confidence drops, and that's the bit you've then got to somehow rebuild yourself, which is difficult.
Yeah. And when we talked to you in the immersive film that we made, you shared a really good example, because obviously a lot of the things that you're describing are not visible things. Whereas I think you'd had an experience where you had some quite visible physical injuries, and that you'd experienced a difference in the sort of support that you got there.
Yeah, I'm very accident prone, I'll admit. I'm always accident prone. And I think in terms of that, I have had severe leg injuries in past, you know, very close together as well. There was suddenly a myriad of support in terms of that, you know, we'll help you get a taxi, we'll help you do this, we'll help you do that. But you're right, when you can't see them and it's more internal. The mental health side of it as well, I think, is pretty prevalent, in terms of that, going back in terms of what Diane said as well. That bit combined with, I've got PTSD because I'd lost my son in 2019. So not actually being able to know or identify what was PTSD and what was menopause felt like a big envelope of feelings, emotions, things like that, and not being able to compartmentalize that was a double struggle, if you know what I mean. So that was really, really difficult to try and do that, but not having that element of support or understanding. So I think it's interesting what Diane says about opening them conversations at work and being that person that does put yourself forward and start that conversation. Maybe if you're not confident doing that, start that with an email. Be the opener, be that person that invites it into your workplace. But I think that the negativity and the impact of that makes you feel less of yourself. It makes you feel less to be able to deliver what you know you can, but because of these symptoms, you're then unable to. So it's the barriers to that as well. So, but I think that the understanding, it's like the physical side of it compared to that invisible side of it, because they don't recognize, it's dismissed straight away as nothing.
Diane, we've talked about people, the kind of the awareness and the understanding what it is that you're trying to support as a starting point. What other barriers do employers face? What do you typically see where they're not quite putting the right support in, and what could they focus on in order to kind of get to a better place?
Yeah, I mean, so again, I think much of it really comes down to the fact that really, if we sort of look back historically, it's only very recently that we have talked about not just menopause, but also menstrual health within the workplace. You know, it's probably only the last decade, and I would say that has significantly improved over the last 5 years. But we've still got an awfully long way to go to ensure that, you know, everybody, whether they employ one person or many thousands of people, we still have a long way to go to ensure that every employer feels equipped to be able to support their teams. And there's a really good reason for doing it, because when people feel supported, they want to stay and
Absolutely.
they're happier. So it's a good reason to do it. But I think in terms of the barriers, I think there is still, quite a significant lack of understanding. And that just comes down to the fact that none of us are ever taught anything about it at a critical stage. Hopefully, again, with all of the awareness and campaigning that's been going on, that is starting to change. But I think, there, particularly for SMEs, as I said, there are challenges in terms of, do I have the budget to bring in, an external educator? No, I don't. So what do I do? Well, thankfully, we do have an awful lot more free resources now, which is great. I think it also depends on the balance of your workforce. Helen said she worked in a very male-dominated space for a time. That was much more difficult than when she worked with more women. So I think that's something that needs to be considered. Who's leading the organisation? Do they feel comfortable to talk about it? And I think the thing is, if you're leading an organisation, you have to get comfortable. You have to make it your job to get comfortable with talking about all sorts of things. And there's a huge amount of multitasking, particularly for somebody running a small business. But if you're going to employ people, you have to get comfortable with talking about all sorts of things. So, are you in an organisation which is large enough to have internal HR? So if you have internal HR, that can be really helpful, because that can be something that they can take on. But obviously, if your HR is outsourced, you or your employees don't necessarily have full-time access to that individual. So there are very practical challenges. But there are also challenges. We talked about the diversity of menopause, the diversity of experience. I think very often when we're talking about menopause in the workplace, we, perhaps people imagine that people work in an office-based environment.
Yeah.
But we have to remember that we have people who are working out on site, people who are working in environments where they hardly ever sit down. There are all sorts of experiences, and all of those things need to be considered individually. So there is no one size that fits all.
Yeah, and I think sometimes that's the thing where sometimes there's been kind of examples that have reached, the media of organisations who in well-intentioned ways may have implemented something that is a one-size-fits-all that may not work for everybody. Just before we move on to our final part, which is going to be looking at who benefits from a good culture around menopause, I always think that there's some really good examples. I wonder if you could just pick one example of something where you've supported an individual who's then managed to get some bespoke adjustments and how that has then allowed them to be supported in the workplace.
So the one that always springs to mind is, and this is going back several years now, is of a woman who got in touch, and she was at the point of handing her notice in. And she said, I just feel that I need to talk to somebody because I just don't know what to do. And I think this is my only option. And, I'm just finding this so difficult to cope with in the workplace. And essentially, the symptom that was the worst for her was that, I think for a lot of people, they think that when people go into menopause, in a spontaneous menopause, that their periods are going to get lighter and further apart. And in fact, unfortunately for some people, they get heavier and more erratic. So you don't necessarily know when that's going to happen. And this particular woman had had a couple of experiences where she had had really heavy bleeding sitting at her desk. It was unexpected. She wasn't prepared. On one occasion, she bled through to her chair. She was terribly embarrassed. She worked in a big open office, so she had to kind of tie her jacket round her waist, get to the toilet facilities, which was about as far from her desk as it could possibly be. And so consequently, in the weeks and months after that, she spent an awful lot of her time worrying that that was going to happen again. So she wasn't able to concentrate fully on what she was doing. But she was also making lots of trips backwards and forwards to the toilets. And she had an additional worry, which was that all of my colleagues are watching me go backwards and forwards to the toilet many times a day. Now, the truth of it is that most people are too engrossed in what they're doing to think, but for her, she had anxiety about anxiety.
Yeah.
So I said to her, what would work for you? What would help? And she said, there are two things I think that would help me. One would be if I could sit almost next door to the toilets. And two would be if I could have somewhere discreet that I could keep a change of clothes and anything else that I needed. And I said, okay, have you spoken to anybody about this? And she said, no. And I said, okay, well, how would you feel about us putting that to your employer? And that's what we did. And within a week, her desk was almost next to the toilets, and her employer had put a bank of lockers in. So not something that picked her out, but a bank of lockers that anybody could use. And her anxiety levels reduced hugely. She was much happier, kept her job. They kept a great employee. Win-win situation.
Absolutely win-win. And when you think about what it would have cost to replace her,
Yep.
the impact it would have had on her life, had she had to leave, would she have had the confidence to get another job? You know, just from some simple but individualized requests and an understanding employer.
And I think the key to all of that was because she was so anxious, she didn't have the bandwidth to be able to consider. She knew as soon as I asked her what would help, but she was so focused on, I'm going to have to hand my notice in. But as soon as I asked her the open question, what would help you, she knew straight away.
So that's something people can immediately use. Just asking individuals that question to help them. Making
them feel like there is another way.
Definitely. And so this leads on to our final point, which I've been digging around on the CIPD, which is Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development website, because they did a fabulous survey and report. If anybody would like to go and dive into it, we'll share the link. Into menopause in the workplace last year, and it's really interesting, and it does underline a lot of the things that we've talked about. And so I'm going to hit you with some stats. Before I do this, just to say, there's a couple of questions in the chat. If anybody wants to add any more, we've got kind of 10-15 minutes for questions now, so please do add any further questions that you might have. So 2/3 of women who are aged 40 to 60 in employment with experience of menopausal symptoms say they have their menopausal symptoms have had a mostly negative effect on them at work. I don't think anybody's going to be surprised by that.
No.
But over half of respondents were able to think of a time when they were unable to go to work due to menopause symptoms. So, you know, over half of respondents are saying that it's preventing them from coming into work sometimes. Now, and this is the point that I think is really crucial, because people on this call are obviously, hopefully we're preaching to the converted a little bit. But there's a big difference between people who feel supported at work and people who don't feel supported at work in how their menopause symptoms impact on them. So 84% of people who feel unsupported at work say their menopause symptoms have a mostly negative effect, compared with 71% who are supported. So they're still having a negative effect, but there is a big gap between those who are supported and not. So, which just sort of underlining the importance of this support. And then this final point, I'm going to get you to kind of comment on these, is that around a quarter of respondents said that their organisation has a stated menopause policy or other support measures in place. So that's 1/4 has support or a policy. And that leaves 43% that don't have any, and a third that don't know if they have any. So if they do, they're not really working, I would say. With these kind of stats in mind, and this kind of the awareness that obviously, you know, every single day you've got examples of these things coming up to you, Diane. What can you add to that? What can you share? How important is it to shift the culture at work for menopause support?
It's vital. But I mean, you know, sort of, it is absolutely vital. We absolutely have to. But again, I come back to the point about, I think in historical terms, I think we're still at a relatively early stage. I think, you know, good things have happened over the last few years. You know, we've got some really good guidance documents now. As I say, we've got more and more free resources. It's being talked about more than ever before. But I think, you know, it's going to take time for this to embed within every organisation, whatever the size. But ultimately, that does come down to having a supportive culture that doesn't just say it cares, but actually shows that it cares. And also for people to have that understanding, because, you know, there's no doubt about it that once people do start to understand it, it really does set some light bulbs off for them in terms of, and I think, you know, the workplace can be such a vital, you know, such a vital hub of information, not just for colleagues and for your team, but also for our personal relationships, because we have to remember that, you know, sort of, we're not, you know, we don't bring half of ourselves to work. We don't just bring our work self, we bring our whole self. So if your menopause is having an effect on your relationship with your partner, with your wider family, with your children, with your, you know, your girlfriends, you know, your sort of your support network. And equally, if you're one of those support network, if what your partner, friend, family member is going through, if that's having an effect on you. So for instance, you know, if your partner is experiencing menopause and they're somebody who perhaps is experiencing horrible night sweats and they're not sleeping well, then the chances are if you share a bed with them, you're not sleeping well either. Well, that has an effect on you too. If your partner is experiencing a loss of confidence or psychological symptoms, that's going to be worrying for you too as the support. So I think we have to think about this sort of more holistically than just menopause at work, menopause at home, menopause in my personal relationship. You know, we are, you know, kind of, we are whole beings and we bring our whole self to all of those situations. But I think that's why education in the workplace and support in the workplace can be so useful, because if you're not getting that information anywhere else, it can be life-changing.
Yeah, definitely. And we've seen lots of examples of that. Okay, I'm going to go to the questions now.
Can I ask Helen a question?
Oh, go.
Helen,
Yeah.
what would you say was the game changer for you in terms of support adjustments? What would you say is or was the one thing that has made the biggest difference to you?
Acceptance that it's not something out of the ordinary, that it's a natural thing. And I think it can be as little as that can make a massive impact.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely. That, I mean, that's really good
Great
to hear.
basis. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good to hear, you know, kind of validation of somebody's experience, and normalizing the conversation, making it something that we can talk about in the workplace. And
Yeah.
why shouldn't we? Because it's part of life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for that.
So I'm going to go from that to a very specific question, which is, can you give guidance on how employers can help with perimenopausal forgetfulness cognitive issues?
So in terms of, so again, it's going to be, so the first thing is, you know, if an individual goes to their line manager, or the business owner, because it could just be one person, if they go and they want to talk about their menopause symptoms and this is something that they're struggling with, again, it's more about asking, what could I do to help you? So, particularly in terms of forgetfulness and cognitive issues, you know, sort of what is it that that person would find the most helpful? Would they find it the most helpful for them to have more breaks? So, you know, as human beings, we shouldn't be sitting focusing on things for more than about 90 minutes at a time anyway, because, you know, our minds start to wander. That's just how we work. So is it a good idea? Would that person benefit from having some more breaks? Would that person, are you in an organization where perhaps that person can have an adjustment to their role temporarily? Would they want that? Would that help them? So again, it comes down to how many employees the business owner or manager has. Are there reminders that can be put in place? Is there a system that can be used that would help that person if they're feeling forgetful? Because I think what often happens with cognitive symptoms is that leads to anxiety. So people are anxious about feeling forgetful.
Yeah.
So you've then got anxiety is then a symptom of struggling with forgetfulness.
Yeah.
So I think it often comes down to, and sometimes it can be really simple things, you know, sort of if there are things that happen regularly that that person's forgetting, well, can they be diarised in some way, shape or form? Is there a reminder service that they can use? You know, for some people, they just stick post-it notes all over everything. If that works for you, go ahead and do it. Is it to a point where they feel, you know, this is actually overload for me and I need to talk about my role being adjusted. So that conversation needs to be had. So I think there are all sorts of things that can be done. But again, you could have, you know, several people struggling with forgetfulness who would want to be able to try different initiatives to help them. And part of it comes down to, you know, what availability is there of other colleagues to be able to step up and help them? What systems are in place? So it's very difficult to give a kind of, again, a one size fits all, but I think there are certainly things that can be achieved for everybody.
Well, so this question kind of leads on from that in a way, in terms of this is a good example of where one size fits all doesn't work or can't work. But I think that this will resonate with quite a few people. So I'm just going to read the question verbatim. The bit I struggle with in terms of employment support is a lot is based on nice office jobs. We're a cleaning company. We cannot control the environment at all. People cannot go and work in a different area. We don't have access on sites to any computers, so can't give people online support. What we've done is to provide each site with an emergency Meno kit, which is wet wipes, a fan, a bottle of water, San Pro. But we're struggling to think of much else. And we've had, in some of the sessions that we've delivered, we've done things. We did one with some operating theatre nurses based in a hospital. Again, very difficult to control the environment.
Yeah.
When you've got that kind of restrictiveness in terms of the task or the environment, what can they do? Any tips for that kind of organisation?
Yeah, so I think, and it's, you know, as I said earlier, you know, kind of people's roles are diverse and their environments are diverse. There is no one size fits all. So I think, well, great that you're doing something. That's brilliant, because it's great that you've taken that on. But I think in terms of other things that you can do, if if the team have a uniform, it's really important to ensure that the fabric of that uniform is not exacerbating any symptoms that they might be experiencing. So lots of organisations, particularly care organisations, are now looking at more technical fabrics. So we used to talk about natural fabrics, but actually they're looking at more technical fabrics, which are being designed specifically for people who might experience lots of hot flushes, night sweats, etc. Because obviously, if you're working a night shift as a cleaner or as a theatre nurse or whatever it might be, or a nurse on a ward, your night sweats don't take account of the fact that you're working. So having, having fabric that is going to be the most helpful and perhaps wicking away, rather than something that is going to actually make those things feel worse. I think in terms of the support, as an organisation, obviously I don't know your setup, but having some kind of, if your team don't come together, having some kind of online. So most people have a mobile phone, having some kind of online support. So maybe an online support group that you come together in, maybe once a fortnight, once a month, which is maybe, I don't know, you maybe do it via one of the apps or whatever. It might be that within the organisation you decide to have somebody who is sort of your menopause champion. So they're a first point of call for any of your employees to go to talk about what they're experiencing, so that they can then be signposted to good. Because if people are working sort of out of a main building environment, it can feel quite lonely as well. Mm-hmm. So I think kind of creating that sense of community, and it's always great to get together in person, but sometimes that does have to be online.
Yeah, absolutely. One final question, and this needs to be quick because we are coming to the end of our time today. But I think that all you'll probably be able to do is to signpost anyway. So we've had a question saying, could I please have some pointers for menopause and mental health? And that's such a broad question that I thought maybe you want to give a signpost to where to start with that.
Yeah, it really is. And I really wanted time for us to talk to Helen about what she mentioned about PTSD, because it's so important. Mm-hmm. So I think sort of in 2 sentences, which is very unusual for me, as Liz will tell you, but in 2 sentences, I think it is really important for people who have ever experienced any kind of mental health related to hormones. So that might be anybody who's ever suffered with very severe PMS or PMDD, or postpartum depression. For anybody who's ever struggled with any of those things, there is evidence to show that for those individuals, because they're related to hormones, perimenopause or menopause, however you come into it, can potentially be a challenge. So there is a link. We're also starting to see that for those who have, whether or not they're diagnosed, who are neurodiverse, we're starting to see some small pieces of research around menopause and neurodiversity and the impact of hormone fluctuation. And one of the things that I hear a lot from people diagnosed and undiagnosed is that they have had tools that they have used in the past that have helped them manage their life. They get to menopause and suddenly they don't find that those tools work so well. Equally, I would say for those who have experienced trauma, past trauma in their lives, So Helen spoke specifically about post-trauma. I think it is very clear, although we don't have lots of research, that again, for many of those individuals, they have developed strategies to deal with, it might be therapy, it might be not, but they've developed strategies. And very often it would appear, I don't know if Helen would agree, that those strategies don't work anymore.
You have to develop new. I think you have to look at what you're not currently doing at this point in time and how you can adapt new. And there is stuff out there. There are lots of organisations what you can get support from, but also putting them things in yourself. So I've got one of them prickly mats. I'm forgetting what they're called. I go cold water swimming. I do lots of things. Do Pilates. Do a lot of meditation, sound baths, things like that. And it's stuff I wouldn't have ordinarily done. But I'm now exploring lots and lots of new avenues because I have to find the one that's right.
And that's exactly the point, Liz. You know, when it comes to any experience of menopause, it's about finding the right combination of things that work for you as an individual.
Are there any particular websites that you would signpost people to if they're struggling with their mental health regarding menopause?
I think Mind is always a good. I think Mind is always a good starting point, and Mind will also then have lots of onward signposting. But I think it's always a good start, and I know there is some stuff on there about menopause.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass back to Zoe now. Thank you very much, everybody, and please do join us for our next webinar, which Zoe will tell you about now.
I hope everyone found that useful. Thank you everyone that joined, and also thank you to our panelists, particularly to Helen for giving up her time today. You will receive an email by this time next week, which will have a link to the recording and some further information there for you. Our next webinar will be on January the 21st, and it's about menopause and employment law, and we'll be joined by an employment law specialist, so that if you're looking at, particularly from a HR perspective, that could be really useful. If you've got any questions relating to this session, then please do reach out to me. My email is on all of the correspondence that you'd had. And yeah, enjoy your afternoon. Oh, and happy Christmas.
Thank you.